Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Trianis, Dean of Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Women in the Workplace Executive Panel discussion. This presentation is the latest event in our Distinguished Speaker Series at Carey Business School, and we are delighted to bring this evening's event to you in collaboration with McKinsey Company. One of the core values of Carey Business School is collaborative leadership. As a school, we demonstrate our collaborative leadership through our commitment to diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, which we strive to foster in everything we do. We also know that as a society, we still have much more work ahead in achieving these cherished ideals in the workplace. We know that women have historically faced many challenges in the workplace, and as will be discussed this evening, many of these long-standing challenges and inequities have been compounded by the current stress and uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. And particular groups of women, including women of color, are facing even greater challenges. Our distinguished panel will be discussing the findings of McKinsey's highly anticipated Women in the Workplace report, which was just released last Wednesday. It is the largest annual study on the state of women in corporate America. It's my pleasure now to introduce Nora Gardner, who will present some findings from the report and then moderate our panel discussion. Nora is a senior partner at McKinsey Company and the managing partner of McKinsey's Washington, D.C. office. Nora combines technical expertise with a passion for people as a client leader and sought-after mentor within McKinsey. Her PhD in biochemistry from Duke brings analytical rigor to her organization work with clients, where she focuses on human capital across private, public, and social sectors, including healthcare, pharma, scientific agencies, and defense and security clients. Nora also heads the office's social impact group, which connects consultants to pro bono work at local nonprofits. It is also fitting to mention that in 2015, Nora was named Working Mother of the Year by Working Mother magazine. Nora, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Alex, and good evening, everyone. Absolutely thrilled to be with you this evening and to share this year's Women in the Workplace report with you. And very, very excited to open up a dialogue with my co-panelists, Karen Peets, Kevin Sowers, and Leslie Slayton-Brown. Before we do that, I do want to take you through the findings and share them with you. As Alex described, this is our 6th year of doing the research with leanin.org. And this has been an unusual and remarkable year. As he mentioned, this is the largest study of its kind, and it has several components. We work with companies and organizations to understand the pipeline from entry level all the way to the C-suite and to look at representation across gender and other factors of the pipeline. We do this in a benchmarkable way year after year so that we can see progress. Another really important part of the research is an attitudinal survey of employees. This year's companies covered more than 10 million employees, and we surveyed more than 40,000 individuals, women and men, to understand their perspectives on women in the workplace. So without further ado, I'll share some of the findings with you. Next slide. So the first is our traditional view of the pipeline. And here you're seeing from the left, entry level all the way up to C-suite, and proportion of women and men and women of color. And you see actually continued progress over the years, with entry level being nearly 50% now in terms of gender, and progress, as we saw last year, in particular in senior levels. So if you're an entry level woman entering the workplace, you're likely to look left and right and feel like you're at parity, and you're likely to look up and hopefully see some inspiring role models who look like you at the top. In particular, we have seen progress over the 6-year time period, at that C-suite level and SVP level, with a combined total of improvement of 20% over the 6 years. We do, however, continue to see the so-called broken rung phenomenon. So women's representation after that entry level does go down at each level, starting at that first promotion to manager. Now, it's very important to note that while we saw continued progress, this is indeed a pre-COVID snapshot in terms of the pipeline. And so all of this data was calendar year 2019. And what you'll see when we step into the results on the survey data, and I think also recent labor market data that's out, supports the finding that because of the COVID pandemic, we were at real risk of backsliding in terms of progress on gender diversity and inclusion. Next slide. So COVID-19 and the effect of the pandemic have just been unprecedented, and it really does put corporate America at a crossroads in terms of gender diversity. While we are now all working virtually, and last year the #1 factor for women cited was increased flexibility, and we do have increased flexibility, we are at real risk due to the stresses being put on the workforce and in particular on women. You see here the top line finding that if women who are considering leaving the workforce actually do, we are facing losing up to 2 million women from the workforce. That, just to put that number into context, that's equivalent to all of the progress in the last 6 years that I shared with you, and it's roughly equivalent to the number of women graduating from undergraduate and graduate degrees each year. So absolutely stunning. And this is the very first year that we have seen a differential between women and men in terms of their plans to potentially leave the workforce. Up until this time, attrition has not been a divider, a driver of representation. Next slide. So I'm just going to take you through some of the findings of the attitudinal survey. Interestingly, when we look at the pandemic challenges and the top 3 challenges that are affecting employees, it's no single challenge, but really a patchwork of things that are challenging. Anxiety, burnout, mental health, and particularly caring for others, be they young people or others, is very challenging for employees in this time. Next slide. And as I mentioned, up until this date, we have not seen any differential in terms of women and men, in terms of either planned or real attrition. This year is very different, and we are seeing women more likely to downshift or leave the workplace entirely, and these are some of the reasons that they cite. Next slide. I'd like to call out 3 groups of women in particular that came out of the research as having special challenges or attention, and they are distinct. So you're seeing here the proportion of employees, men, women, or of these groups who are experiencing and feeling exhaustion, burnout, etc. And in particular, I'll highlight mothers of young children who are extremely challenged in the COVID environment, senior women, in particular, you see challenges with exhaustion for senior women, and then Black women experiencing all of the challenge, including an outsized feeling of exclusion in the workplace. So we'll go into each of these in a little more detail. Next slide. First, for mothers. For those of you who have seen the research before, you may have heard about the so-called double shift. So this is, how are household responsibilities divided within heterosexual dual career couples. And, we have seen over the years, household responsibilities falling disproportionately to women in those heterosexual dual career couples. What we're seeing in the pandemic is an added double shift. So you're seeing here 40% of mothers report that they are doing 3+ extra hours of household responsibilities per day as a result of the pandemic. So this, adds up to 15, 20 hours a week, an additional part-time job on top of the double shift that they were already working. So it's no surprise when you see a statistic like 1 in 3 of working mothers have considered leaving the workforce, as compared to 1 in 5 of the fathers. Next slide. Now, senior level women. Senior level women are a unique group in that they are really facing compounding challenges. So senior level women are more likely to be an only of their gender, a phenomenon we've talked about over the years in the research. They are more likely to be in a dual career couple and therefore have less support at home. They are more likely to be mothers. And we believe that is why we see them exhausted, burned out, and feeling that they're pressured to work more. Next slide. Senior women also are the most likely to report feeling always on, and feeling always on was the largest predictor of potentially downshifting or leaving the workforce. So we see that 1 in 4 senior women have considered leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers versus 1 in 6 senior men. Next slide. So this is bad enough on its own. I talked to you early on about the pipeline. You may enter and look up and see someone who looks like you, a very inspiring role model at the top. We are very much at risk of losing those role models. The additional concern is that senior women also happen to be doing more than their fair share of sponsoring, mentoring others, and acting as allies to women and people of color. So the concern is that senior women could have, of course, an effect on the pipeline, but an even outsized effect throughout the pipeline. You see here the senior women and the proportion of them who are acting as mentors, sponsors, and taking allyship actions relative to senior men and all employees. Next slide. The next section gives voice to Black women in our survey. Black women have always been challenged in terms of the workplace and whether they have equal treatment in the workplace and their feelings around it. Here on the left, you're seeing that Black women, more than half of them are an only, so likely to be the only Black woman in the room versus 20% of women overall. They are also more likely, and have always been in our survey, more likely to experience so-called microaggressions. So 1.5 times more likely than all women in the survey to say they don't have equal opportunity for advancement, more than 1.7 times more likely not to have a strong ally on their team. Next slide. And this is compounded by the direct effects of COVID on communities of color and the Black community. In our survey, Black women were 2.5 times more likely than women overall to have reported the death of a loved one due to the pandemic, and 1.5 times more likely than women overall to feel that they could not share that loss in the workplace. Therefore, again, no surprise that Black women are reporting they're more likely to leave the workforce, as you see on the right. And again, in terms of setting us back in progress, Black women make up less than 10% of the corporate workforce. And so if we don't act now to retain these talented women, it could be very hard to bring them back and keep up. Next slide. The encouraging news around Black women is that we do know that allyship and allyship actions do actually have a positive effect on their workplace experience. So here on the top of the page, you're seeing positive experiences of the workplace, and on the lower half of the page, you're seeing microaggressions that are experienced. And on the left, the experiences of all non-Black women, and on the right, comparing those who have allies and those without allies. And you see that Black women with allies are more likely to experience an inclusive workplace and positive experience, and they're also less likely to experience those microaggressions. Next slide. And there's a little bit of encouraging news here in terms of allyship, that there's very strong desire and commitment to being an ally among the employees we surveyed. So more than 60% of employees surveyed self-identified as allies to women of color. However, when we look at the actions associated with allyship, next slide, only 39% of those employees publicly acknowledge or give credit to women of color for their ideas and work. Next slide. 29% took a public stand to support race equity. And next slide. And only 10% actually mentored or sponsored women of color. So we do see that allyship works. We see a high desire to be allies, and what we'd like to see is those actions actually being taken. Next slide. So we are at a crossroads. The data and the insights do show that there's an opportunity in ways of working in order to create a more empathetic and equitable work environment. You know, as I said, last year's results showed the #1 factor to increase women's inclusion was work-life flexibility. You see some of the positive aspects potentially to ways of working here on the left. 93% of companies believe some jobs can be worked remotely. More than 77% of employees would plan to work from home. In theory, this should open up access to larger talent pools, more geographic constraints, and more flexibility in the workplace to make sure it is working for everyone and they're able to bring their full selves to work. However, if we don't take those actions, we really do risk losing progress that we've made over the last 6 years. Next slide. So just a bit around some of the actions, and there's more in the report that we encourage companies to take. Making work more sustainable, whether that be adding additional days such as COVID days, resetting norms around flexibility, and very, very importantly, having leaders visibly encourage those norms and role model those norms. We encourage companies to take a look at their performance reviews to make sure that they are, of course, continue to be fair and free from bias, but also that what they're asking for is actually attainable in today's environment. Minimizing bias and taking steps to do so, and also making sure people are aware of that bias. Again, in the new ways of working, there's potential for additional bias to creep in. We encourage companies to adjust their policies to support employees in the demands that they're facing. And very importantly, to survey their employees to make sure that one, they're aware of those policies, and that two, those policies are helping them where they're most challenged. And to really step up the employee communication to enhance that awareness, sense of belonging, and inclusion. And then specifically for Black women, to take an intersectional approach and to foster a culture that both supports and values Black women in particular. So with that, I would like to invite my panelists into the conversation. Let me do some quick introductions, and then we'll hear from each of you briefly, and then we'll start our dialogue. First is Karen Peets. Karen is the Chief Administrative Officer of Citigroup, and she's the board chair of the Carey School and a university trustee. Karen joined Citi in 2020 as Chief Administrative Officer, and previously was at Bank of New York Mellon for almost 20 years. Ultimately, she was the president of the firm. Karen has been active in various corporate and nonprofit boards, including Train Technologies, Guardian Life, Amherst Holdings, and the Johns Hopkins University. Next is Leslie Slayton Brown. Leslie is Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at HP. Leslie has over 20 years of experience in the technology industry and strongly believes that the time for talk is over and the time for action is now. She has led efforts to address the digital divide. She also served as principal investigator for the National Action Council for Minorities in Engineering Computing Project, and she's the co-founder of Curated Pathways to Innovation, a collective impact solution focused on broadening participation and access for minorities and women in STEM. She was recently named to the Most Powerful Women in Corporate Diversity list by Black Enterprise. Kevin Sowers, who is president of the Johns Hopkins Health System and the executive vice president of Johns Hopkins Medicine. He's only the second person in Johns Hopkins history to hold these dual roles. And through this, he oversees the health system's 6 hospitals and also serves as chair as Johns Hopkins Community Physicians. He came to Johns Hopkins Medicine after 32 years with the Duke University Health System, the last 8 of those as president and CEO of Duke University Hospital. He's active in many professional and community organizations and is a member of the Vizient Board of Directors and the AAMC Council of Teaching Hospitals and Health Systems Administration Board. And he's also an American Academy of Nursing Fellow. So an incredibly esteemed panel. I'm sure with lots of perspectives to add to the dialogue. Maybe we can take down the slides and just say hi and hear from each of you what this brought up for you and how your experience has colored your thoughts on women in the workplace. Karen, can we go to you first?
Thank you for including me, and also to you and McKinsey and Lean In for doing this kind of multi-year set of research. It's been fantastic for women because you have gathered so much information and gleaned so many really, really good trends. I salute the work you're doing. And I have to say, I got kind of a pit in my stomach. I'm a former working mom and now a grandmother of 4 granddaughters, of course. One of my friends said she couldn't believe we were producing so many women. But it really just gave me a pit in my stomach because, I started working in banking in 1982. And at that point, you kind of dressed so you kind of looked like a man's because you were just trying to fit in and you were just so concerned about acting like a female. And to have come so far and to think that we have 2 million people at risk now, those folks are just too hard to get in the pipeline. And it really gave me kind of a real pit in my stomach. I think everything that you said about the stresses of particularly working moms, felt them myself, see my daughter and my daughter-in-law now dealing with the same things. And I think what you said about all of the things that companies need to do, I think are spot on, because it isn't good enough to just tell the employees, work it out, which was kind of the way it was in the old days. It needs to be a shared agenda for everything that you spoke about, women, the lost rung, Black women in specific and in particular, and certainly mothers and people who are caring for others just need those special consideration. Last thing I'll say is I do think one positive about COVID, and there aren't many, is that I do believe we've shown ourselves we can have much more flexible work than perhaps most, particularly large companies, thought. And I think the fact that we're doing this with 600 people tuned in and we're doing it by Zoom pretty much demonstrates the point. So there is, I think, that silver lining.
Yes, and Karen, Citi gave a lot of us something to look forward to and look up to with Breaking the Glass Ceiling with Jane Fraser's appointment, which is really terrific. So
absolutely,
you and the whole team.
And she deserved every part of it. So
wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Leslie, can we go over to you?
Thank you so much for having me. And like Karen, I started in banking, so I know the dress code, right? Yeah, it's interesting. When I read the study, the first thing that came to mind for me was validation. Validation as a Black woman, as a woman of color, in understanding the kind of the place, the crisis that we're in. And as a Black American, it's a dual crisis. When you think of COVID and the impact, the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities, and then you have what I call post George Floyd, right? Of being able to understand, deeply understand and empathize with the community, the Black community, around the injustices that have occurred. And by the way, we have this open wound, because this is not new for us. It is, I think the silver lining in COVID was that people were stalled and at home and watching to be able to see this happen, and happen, unfortunately, and grueling live. But at the same time, that was needed, I think, to better understand the dual crisis that underrepresented communities, Black communities, Brown communities are already facing. And so as a woman also in the industry or in the workplace, and as a woman in senior leadership, and then being a Black woman, there's just this multi-layered effect, right? And so I found myself reading, going, yeah, very, very much was validating. I will say the one surprise to me was when you think about Black women, and 3 in 4 Black women are the primary income earners, to say, or to raise your hand to say, I would leave the workplace, really raised the question to me around, would you leave the workplace? But we also know that small and medium businesses, the largest percentage of startup small and medium businesses are Black women, are women of color, Latino women as well. And so that was the one thing that was very interesting to me.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. And that, when we have in past years followed women who have left the workplace, and in particular Black women who left the workplace, it was often to do something very entrepreneurial, as you described, and to start their own company. I think that what's challenging again with the pandemic is that that's also really hitting small business very hard as well. Yeah. Thank you for that. Kevin.
Thank you, Nora, and good evening, everyone. And I want to thank McKinsey and Lean In also for doing this incredible work that really sets the stage for these types of dialogues, and also for the Carey Business School in facilitating this evening. You know, I come to this discussion from a very different place. I am not a banker. I may look like a banker tonight, but I am not a banker. But I began my career as a nurse. So what most people don't realize is over half of my career, I have been raised by women leaders. I didn't know what it was like to be raised by men in leadership roles. And so very early on in my career, I had to, with my peers and my leaders, understand the issues that women face in the workplace. And so one of the things that it reminded me as I read the report is some of the challenges that I remember back in the 80s when I became a nurse are some of the challenges that women still face in the workplace today, and have we really addressed the issues that we are faced with. One of the other things that was striking for me is I've had the opportunity to round throughout our hospitals during the COVID crisis. And I know there's, in the health sector, there's varying layers, but for the people who are on the front lines delivering COVID care, I would describe it as kind of a moral distress that they've experienced, because it's changed how we deliver care professionally. It's limited families' access to being with their loved ones. And so that, on top of the issues of the impact of COVID on underrepresented minorities, and then also as I look at the impact, as Leslie was referring to, the impact that we've seen on social injustice, and the discussion that's evolved around issues of structural and systemic racism that still exist in this country. And so for me, as I read through this, it's a moment that I think we have to stop and reflect about a cultural change. It's not just about changing policies and procedures because we've tried that before as a country. We've tried that within our companies. What's going to be our commitment to a cultural change that will create the evolution that we need for women in the workplace, and especially underrepresented minorities? I've spent a lot of time in my career committed on an annual basis to developing underrepresented minorities, and the challenges they face and what you have to do in supporting them as a coach and mentor is uniquely different, because when you talk about the onlys, there was an African American woman that I was once mentoring, and she said, when I walk in the room, I look around and I want to see who else looks like me. And she said, typically, I'm the only one.
No.
So she said, I have this double pressure that I feel of not only acting as an executive, but will I be judged because of the color of my skin and what I'm about to say, not only because I'm a woman. So the report reminded me of the importance of senior leaders committing in their organizations to developing women of color. So I'll stop there, Nora.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. I would like to spend a little bit of time on actions that either companies are taking or can take. Kevin, I think you make a very important point around culture change. Commitment is very, very important, but it's clearly not sufficient. I found, sponsorship is very important, and I always find the lack of sponsorship in reality, in terms of the actions, sad and very compelling. I'm curious for you, what actions do you think really will make a difference, or maybe are your companies or organizations trying? And I realize, Karen, you're in financial services, very different than Leslie in tech and Kevin in healthcare. But I'd love to hear thoughts on actions that may move the needle. Do you want to jump in first?
Sure. I mean, I've been in and around this topic for so long that you get a little jaded in some ways about what are the best ways to go about it. What I'm finding at Citi is, first of all, we do business in 96 countries around the world. So you're de facto diverse, right? And then I think the other thing that it really works is that we actually count diversity, meaning leaders are judged by how diverse their teams are, right? Which is a lot different than saying diversity is good. If you're judged by, well, you have Latinos, you have Blacks, you have whites, you have, and people are actually not with quotas, but actually evaluating, do you have a diverse team? And if you don't, how are you going to get there? To me, and it's linked to your compensation, that you actually have a diverse team. To me, that's really getting there. And then the other thing I think that Citi has done very well is to express outrage about the George Floyd situation. We have a Black CFO, so he's very senior in the company, and he is really a link to Wall Street in terms of speaking to, analysts, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, when it all happened, he said to himself, should I speak out? And then he said, no, I have to. And Citi has just put $1 billion out for Black causes of all different types to put our money where our mouth is, to try to help folks who have not had the advantages that all of us have had. So, the power of companies to make a difference, if they really just double down on what's important, is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I like to say that intentionality matters, right? And so, Nora, it's interesting because so HP is a 86-plus-year-old company, and the interesting thing is that it's not new for us to focus on the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. human rights, and even in this racial and social injustice space. And so it was something that was very deeply rooted in the foundation at the onset of building the company itself with Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. So what's exciting about that is I was attracted to come work at a company, first and foremost, that I knew cared about this space for me as a working mother, a woman, a Black woman, all the intersectionality that comes with that. And in light of COVID and George Floyd, amongst others, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and the list goes on. It's interesting for me, and because I work in this space, I was actually frozen in time for a moment, in understanding like what's going on, the magnitude of that, the trauma that actually came with it for me, and understanding that I belong to a community that has long had to fight and to deal, in this space. And so it wasn't that I would speak up or not. It was getting past my own emotion, my own hurt, my own pain, my own frustration, my own anger, in order to deal with it in my role. And so we very and let me say this also, because it is a part of the DNA of our company. When we separated in November of 2015, we were very intentional about creating a diverse board of directors. That matters. That matters because it's senior most level that your vision is pushed out, and the senior most level is your sponsorship and your mentorship and all of those things. Not to say that the work's not happening at the lower levels as well, but it matters that you have a board of directors of women of color, Black and brown and Asian and everything, to be able to say that we as a company are going to take a stand. This is a fundamental part of our values. And therefore, and we know also it's a business imperative for us. And so it wasn't a question of were we going to speak up or not, right? And so that said, we very quickly mobilized. We had a town hall session. We pulled together a task force. And by the way, when we saw the decline of women, senior women raising their hand to say, I'm opting out right now, we very quickly looked at and did a survey and said, you know what, we're going to do a mandatory closure in August to give people that time to breathe and relax and recuperate and rejuvenate from all of this stuff that's going on. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, we had our general counsel put together a push for Blacks on Board legislation in the state of California, and a mandate for year-over-year growth within that. And I can go on and on, I don't want to monopolize the time. But in the midst of all that is going on, it's no longer the opportunity, as we say, to stand by and watch. It is, how do you become the upstander and speak up on behalf of, right? And so it wasn't fully Leslie's responsibility as the head of global diversity, equity, and inclusion to push the actions that we needed to see happen, and to move beyond just the talk. But really to mobilize, to get other people to raise their hand, to stand up and stand on behalf of what needed to happen.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Kevin.
I think, once again, I come to this conversation from a very different perspective. Being an openly gay male whose husband is African-American, I understand conscious and unconscious bias on a very personal level. Mm. And what I had to step back in the midst of this and recognize is a lot of our leadership at all levels of the organization don't know how to have the conversation with our workforce.
Yeah.
And so a very basic element is beginning to educate people on how to have the conversation in the midst of the crisis that we just described with their workforce, so that we can clearly understand what the workforce believes needs to change. Because if we sit in the executive suite thinking we know what needs to change, then we're not leading culture change. We're making ourselves feel good, but we're not really leading the culture change that needs to take place. So number one, educating leaders on how to have the dialogue. Number two, capturing that in a meaningful way that will inform your diversity and inclusion strategic plan. And then number three, setting accountability models for that plan and key milestones to achieve is incredibly important. I'd want to add one more thing that I've noticed, though, because we have focused on, mostly in our discussion thus far, African-American women, and everything we've said is true. But I would also say that I've witnessed for Asian women xenophobia because of what's gone on in COVID. And I would also recognize that in the Latinx population, the women who have not just responsibility for their family, but generations of family in their household, I think there's added stressors of what COVID has done in terms of the positivity rate in that community, but also the extra burden of generational care that Latinx women have seen.
Yeah. And if I can add to Kevin, what Kevin just said too, when you think about the underrepresented groups in general, COVID has had a tremendous impact. LGBT community, people with disabilities, and it is astounding that we have are already in a place of inequity, but then COVID, and then, so I say crisis on top of crisis, the dual crisis puts us even at greater risk overall. And you look at the unemployment rate, unemployment rate for African American, I think was in excess of 13% in August. And that was well before business closures and furloughs and layoffs and all of those things. And so Kevin's absolutely right that those underrepresented, marginalized communities are at now even a greater loss and gap as a result of the dual crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, our research would also show absolutely the business case for diversity, Leslie, that you mentioned. So diverse teams absolutely perform better. Companies with diverse leadership teams perform better. And I do think the points that you're bringing up around intersectionality are critical. And I think it's why, the idea of conscious inclusion can be a very powerful one. There are visible portions of people's identities and those that are less visible. And the only way to make sure you're really performing as a team and make that everyone can bring their full selves is to ensure conscious inclusion of every member of the team. Leslie, I did want to ask you specifically, I found one of the most striking things in the research that over 60% of people said they were an ally to women of color. And then when we look at the actions, the actions are not necessarily there. What suggestions do you have for those well-meaning team members to really ensure that voices are being heard, that people, and in particular Black women, feel heard, included, and able to fully bring themselves and be a part of the team?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't quite met that 60% myself yet. But I know that there's some very well-intended folks out there. I think also it's interesting because when you think about allyship and advocacy, those are two very different things, yes. Right? And allyship is great. Don't get me wrong. I actually think what women of color need more now is advocacy, because your research, the research showed this. We're exhausted. you're exhausted, you know, having to carry the weight of the village on our shoulders, and to care for and continue working and checking on your family and ensuring that your kids are, you know, online. And in some cases in rural communities, there's not even the infrastructure for that distance learning and virtual learning that has to occur. So when I think about allyship and advocacy, and I always put those two together, one of the things that we did was we very quickly convened an all-Black cohort, what we call Catalyst, of Black women and men both, to be able to look at and to be a part of a program that typically requires nomination. And in our case, it was one of those things where we said, let's look at some of our data and see what is the progression. How fast are people, you know, moving up? Movement and promotion both matter, right? Along their career. And so when we convened this cohort, it really was in response to, you know what, we're not doing as well as we need to be doing. And it's not that it is a segregated or a token program. It is a very well-intended program to increase the opportunity that we've just overlooked. And so so that was one of the things that, you know, that we put in place immediately. Allyship and advocacy also is something that it's not self-proclaimed. It is something that you have to be asked to be a part of. And so when we think about the work that we're doing, you know, day to day, it's simple things in some cases, like, you know, and I do this on a regular basis, is if I'm going to be presenting something, I typically vetted it with the people that it's intended for prior to presenting it, and asking for their support if there's dissension or wanting to understand what their concerns might be, so that when I go into that room, you have other people speaking up, because sometimes your voice just isn't heard. And I don't care what the title is, and I don't care, I'm 6 feet tall, I don't care how tall you are or any of those things. It's just, it's a microaggression that exists, that sometimes as women of color, we are invisible. And so it helps to have an ally or an advocate that you can ask to help for that support, to speak up on your behalf. Ask folks to say, you know, this was said, or this, you know, this happened in the meeting. If that ever occurs again, could you be comfortable enough to support me or to speak up? And so we also did training around, and Kevin talked a little bit about this, around our leadership and giving them the tools to have courageous conversations. But we also said, you know what, it's not for a Black person to teach you what you need to do, to go out and learn on your own too. Right. And so those are some of the things that we did. So from book clubs to having closed door sessions, discussion groups, listening sessions. We do business in 170 countries across the globe. And ironically, Black lives mattered across a lot of those countries in some way, shape, or form. COVID definitely impacted across those 170 countries. And so it's just a matter of really being very intentional. You'll hear me use that word a lot, intentional, of building a culture that invites people to come into the conversation versus run away from it.
Very helpful. Thank you. I do want to talk a little bit about the mental health challenges, anxiety, exhaustion that we pick up in the numbers. And, you know, this is actually across the board, women and men in the survey. Just the blending of work and home that we're all experiencing is very challenging. And the virtual setting, while in some ways you might think it adds a lot of flexibility, we certainly see colleagues and employees, overworking, not really feeling they're able to set reasonable norms and standards for their work, and not necessarily, seeing that or feeling that it's acceptable by the senior folks on their teams. Karen, do you have any thoughts on that? I would imagine your folks are pretty hard charging and maybe having a little challenge. We've certainly noticed this in our teams, that, people were sprinting, and we're realizing now this is truly a marathon, and maybe, like this for some time. And so we've really got to get a handle on the work-life balance and the overwork.
I completely agree. And I think that, as with most things, sensitive leadership is key. Maybe you're an empty nester like I am. That means I could work all day Saturday, all day Sunday, but that doesn't mean that I should request that the folks who work for me and with me do that. So I think that's always the key is, have a little bit of humanity, in fact, a lot of humanity and sensitivity. But I think it's also when surveys are super important. We're finding we're surveying things like burnout. We're surveying things like, do you want to come back to the office? Because there could be a whole range of people who don't want to put a foot in the office. And really realizing that the voice of the employee is super critical at this time. And you need to kind of get lots of honest feedback. And if that has to be anonymous, then so be it. You have to ask for it.
Yeah. We've also there's a question or two in the chat around, managing and leading and how to do that with empathy. And also, when deadlines have to be met and work has to get done. Kevin or any of the panelists, do you have advice or thoughts on, how to get this right when you don't have really great visibility on what's going on for the members of your teams?
Well, there's a couple things that I would highlight. Number one, I think in healthcare, there's an element that we can allow people to work remotely. And then there is an element of the work that we do that requires human touch and humans at the bedside, humans in the clinic. So we have this mix. And I think one of the things that we're really looking at right now is we believe there will be a part of our workforce that will never come back into quote unquote a building. They will be doing remote work. But one of the challenges we have is we have not trained our managers how to manage people and promote people and do succession planning and coach and mentor people remotely. That's just not something that was in our skill set before. So that's number one, identifying what part of your workforce is actually going to remain at home. How do you set them up to be successful at home? And then how do you make sure that you train your managers how to manage them, but also promote them when they're not present in the workplace, as we historically thought about that. As it relates to that element of our workforce that needs to be present, we're going to have to learn to become more flexible. Back to the question that you asked about mental health, I looked at our employee health plan statistics just for the workforce within the health system, about 30,000 employees. We've seen a 26% increase in mental health admissions. And since COVID started, we've seen 1,300 people who have no history of mental health or any medications associated with that, now on anti-anxiety medications and antidepressants. And what I worry most about is those are the people who've had the courage to come forward and say, I need help. So we're also training our managers on how to identify people who might be at high risk for mental health issues, depression, anxiety, because we had a crisis around that before COVID. And now COVID has only exacerbated that. And when I talk about flexibility, it's things as simple as maybe we shouldn't have, for mothers who are working at home, maybe we shouldn't have Zoom calls at noon during lunchtime. And yes, if your kid comes into the Zoom picture, it's okay, because we know you're doing double duty at home. There's got to be some flexibility around work schedules. There may be people who would rather get their work done from 1 to 8 at night because of what they can do with other support in their household. So I really do believe there's, for us, these two segments that we have to manage. One that has to be present and another part that can work remotely, but we do have to think about becoming more flexible as we approach that.
I agree. And even the consideration of, Zoom fatigue and inclusion versus exclusion of, are you on video or not? And one of the things that we've started doing is actually inviting families to some of the sessions that we have, the educational sessions that we have. I think we also have to change the mindset of the stigma that exists within mental health. And one of the things that we've talked about is we call it wellness, mental wellness, and we have financial wellness, and we have all these different webinars and discussions to constantly keep it front and center for people to be able to come to those sessions without fear of being stigmatized by, under that kind of mental health umbrella. But, one of the questions, Nora, you asked around what we need to do for our leadership. I believe that new leaders need to be more empathetic leaders in this new world of virtual, of mobile. And one of the things that and I've done and have instructed our leaders to do with what first was COVID, and then, with kind of the racial things that were going on, was to reach out to your employees. Like, just reach out to your employees and ask them how they're doing. Reach out to your Black employees empathetically to understand how are they dealing with the crisis that we're in. Reach out to women and working mothers and working parents in your organization. Know your people well enough to know the behavior changes that exist when somebody's usually on video and now you never see them, or they're not speaking up, and because you've got folks that are introverts, and so it's a different experience for them. But start with yourself. Start by letting people know what your vulnerabilities are and what you're faced with. And I had a, and I don't know if I'm freezing or not, I see my thing spinning. I had a leader say in a meeting once, as he was starting his meeting, in his background and his bookshelf, and he had some family pictures, and he talked about his kids, he talked about his family, he talked about his daughter being away at school. This was early COVID quarantine, and he talked about the concern that he has as a parent that his daughter's away. He talked about the woman across the street, the elderly woman across the street that he and his wife check on and deliver groceries to. And I feel like when you can show your own vulnerability, you can better build trust in this virtual environment that we're in, and mobile environment that we'll be going to as we kind of transition or kind of post-pandemic.
Thank you. And I realize we've gotten so many questions on the chat and we're just getting going. We do hope that this does start a dialogue, for each of you in your own community, in your workplace, with your friends, with your family. I think the point, Leslie, that we're human beings and we need to carry this through, ask each other how we're doing, and really be willing to listen to the answer. I'm going to pass it back to Alex, but I just want to thank Karen, Leslie, Kevin, and of course, Johns Hopkins for hosting this. And I do hope that we've stimulated the start of a dialogue for each of you who has joined us this evening. Alex, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Nora. I too would like to thank Leslie, Karen, and Kevin so much. But Nora, thank you so much for all the work, the terrific work that you've done with this survey, and as a leader of a business school, I think business schools, all business schools have a huge responsibility to really be reading those survey results as we think about the future of the workplace, think about specifically the future of women and women of color in the workplace. We have a lot of work clearly to be done, but we have a lot of people willing to help us do that work. One of the questions that came up or in the chat box was from one of our alumni who said, how can I help be a mentor to our students? So to all of you alumni out there, thank you for what you're already doing. Those of you in our Women's Alumni Network, the fantastic work to get that alumni network up and running. And we will be tapping all those great mentors out there to really make sure that the future business leaders, whether they be women or men, are entering the business world really able to attack all these challenges and make sure that things get consistently better over time. So I want to thank everybody for participating in this webinar. Those of you in the Business Leadership Society, hopefully we'll see you in the green Zoom room in a minute. And thank you all of you for participating today.